Welcome everyone. We'll wait a few moments as more folks join our evening program. Welcome to you all. Welcome for joining us on this glorious spring evening. My name is Andy Forsyth, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Ridgefield Library. Tonight's program is Voting Rights in America, Ensuring Fair and Full Voting for All. And it's being brought to you by the library in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Marilyn Carroll, President of the League, who will tell you more about this evening's program and presenter. Marilyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andy. As Andy said, I am Marilyn Carroll, President of the League of Women Voters, and I'd like to thank you all for zooming in for this very important presentation about voting in America. I'd like to thank the library for co-sponsoring and hosting this event. The folks at the library have done an extraordinary job of supporting, educating, and entertaining the entire community virtually and in person when they could during the pandemic, and we're fortunate indeed to be blessed with such a fantastic organization and look forward to their opening sometime soon. For those of you unfamiliar with the League of Women Voters, we are a grassroots, nonpartisan political organization who encourages informed and active participation in government through education and advocacy. We do not support or oppose any political party or candidates, but work on vital issues of concern to our members and the public. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to mention that Ms. Pérez has been kind enough to stay and answer your questions. So you can start typing them in the Q&A session any time of Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Andy and I will monitor the Q&A and bring up any questions or comments you may have. Please don't use the chat function, but use the Q&A function. Now it is my great honor to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Myrna Pérez. Ms. Pérez is director of the Brennan Center for Justice, Voting Rights and Election Program and leads the program's research, advocacy, and litigation work nationwide. An expert on voting rights and election administration, she is the author of several nationally recognized reports and articles. Her work has been featured in media outlets across the country, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and MSNBC. She has testified before Congress and several state legislators on a variety of voting rights related issues. She is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School and has also served as an adjunct professor of clinical law at NYU School of Law. And last but not least, I can't tell you how thrilled we were to find out long after we had asked her to speak that Myrna is a member of the League of Women Voters, for which we could not be more proud. Welcome, and thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you. Buenas noches. Good evening. I am Myrna Pérez. I'm very excited to be talking to you all today. I'm going to have a presentation in the background so that you guys can see some of the stuff we're talking about in a visual way, but I'm just going to be doing a lot of talking with y'all. I will also note that I am a law professor, so I'm going to potentially give all of you a quiz if people aren't paying attention. But I think first I want to start off by saying that the Brennan Center is named after Justice William Brennan, former Supreme Court leader and justice from New Jersey. And he made famous the idea of a living constitution. And what that means is that he didn't think that the Constitution's power and strength and persuasion and ideals derived from words that were written on a text and meant to be interpreted in a flat way, but rather it was a document that needed to be dynamic and responsive to the challenges of the moment. So if you are one of these people that think that we were at our best when our country was first founded and didn't include women or people of color or people without property in the electoral process, this is probably not a conversation for you. If you are someone of good faith, however, who believes that we need to have discussions involving research and resources and facts that go to the heart of some of the really tricky issues in our country, then I'm hoping that you will be part of this conversation. Now, one of the really neat things about my job is that we work in a very interdisciplinary way. And by that, I mean, we spend a lot of time doing deep research. I spend a lot of time crunching numbers, conducting interviews, before the pandemic, getting dusty in libraries. And then I think we need to also make sure that we are trying to get things done in the world. So that means we spend a lot of time in state houses all across the country trying to get legislation moved and passed. I'm excited to talk about some of the stuff happening in Connecticut. This is something that we do work in nationwide. I have some people who are actually on the ground, and then I have some people that do a lot of the work on the phone and with partners on the ground. We're litigators. We're a law firm. We have a number of suits that are active and a number of suits that we consider filing. And finally, we try to win in the court of public opinion as well. You'll hear me say, as an educator, I think one of the biggest things we can do is try and bring facts to the American public and try and bring research and data to folks who have a hard time getting it. And part of that means making sure that our communications are accessible and are realistic and real world with what people are experiencing. So before we can move forward, I think we do need to look back. And so we should talk a little bit about what happened in the 2020 election. It was a very hard year. I think all can admit that. It was a very hard year for quite a number of reasons. The pandemic was a challenge and a test for this country. And I think it laid bare many of the cracks in the system that we had been sort of muddling through without having addressed. We had very honest and hard conversations about the state of race and the state of racism and the way that racism still infects our institutions of power, and the way changing demographics and changing expectations are intersecting with that past of our country. We had some politicians that seemed to think that the political process was designed as a way of keeping themselves in the power, as opposed to making sure that people choose their politicians rather than politicians choosing their voters. So with a lot of work and a lot of advocacy from all sorts of sectors of society, we saw a number of changes happen in the 2020 election. We had 35 states and DC make substantive changes to their electoral processes in order to make voting during a pandemic more available to Americans who were experiencing tough times. When that could not happen in state houses, we saw people going to the courts. We saw more than 165 lawsuits filed to enhance, advance, or protect voters' rights. About 108 of them ended up successfully changing the way that elections were run. We did see a countervailing force where a good number of lawsuits, about 80 of them, were filed to try and prevent some of these changes. And then we saw some progression in the state legislatures where places like Iowa and DC passed laws that would make it easier for people with criminal convictions in their past to vote. So we saw a mix of a whole bunch of things. And what that resulted in is we actually had an election. I have to say that as someone who was working around the clock, I was so proud of this country. And I was so proud of the way that Americans of all political persuasions, Americans from all walks of life really banded together to make sure that the election was pulled off. We had people from the business community donating things like stadiums for usage for polling places. We had students sign up to be poll workers. We had ordinary Americans offering to take their neighbors to the polls. We had historical turnout as a result of that. And I think what that should be sending in a very clear message is that voters care about voting. We care about our right to vote. We care about our right to vote so much that we are willing to turn out in the middle of a once in a century pandemic because we care so much about the right to vote. We did, however, also see concerted, very real efforts to try and depress and suppress that vote. I think we can't overlook that. If we are going to improve as a country, we need to be able to have a hard look at ways in which we can improve and ways in which our democracy doesn't include us. And we saw efforts before and after the election to undermine elections as a way of resolving political differences. And I think that that's what is something that people sometimes don't remember. And I didn't invent that concept. That was the great civil rights historian, Taylor Branch. The vote is a piece of nonviolence. It is a way that we resolve political differences peacefully in this country. And some other countries don't resolve their differences peacefully. And there is a lot at stake for us being able to depend and rely on the vote in order to resolve those political differences peacefully. And if we are going to be the country that lives up to our ideals, then we need to make sure that our democracy is robust and participatory and inclusive. Our country right now is facing a reckoning for things that we have done and things that we have left undone. And we are not going to find a solution, in my opinion, unless we leverage the talents, expertise, and experiences of all Americans, certainly those that are closest to the pain. So the big frame that I look at the world is one in which we can have reasonable political disagreements over some very arcane or very technical issues of policy, but Americans, irrespective of your background, irrespective of your beliefs, should believe that our elections should be free, fair, and accessible, and that our democracy works best when it includes all of us. In 2021, we are seeing a phenomenon that I've actually only seen one other time in my career of efforts in the states to try and restrict the right to vote. We did see something akin to this, something similar to this in 2010 after the political influences and political powers in the state houses changed after President Barack Obama had been elected in 2008. But this is next level. That was the worst thing we had seen since the civil rights era, and this is something that is dwarfing this numerically. We have seen 360 bills be introduced in more than 47 states that would make it harder for people to register, to vote, to participate and vote. We are seeing this in red states, blue states, purple states. Certainly not every piece of legislation that is introduced passes. But the fact that this volume is so high is something that should make people stand up and take notice. Like, why is it that there are politicians that think that it is advancing their political career to be putting more barriers in front of the ballot box instead of looking at what happened in the last election and figuring out ways how we can expand and increase access. We are going to be coming up with new numbers because we are crunching them and we're releasing them tomorrow. So I apologize if this were on Monday, I would have higher numbers for you than those 360, but I don't want to scoop myself here. So I'm going to stick with that for now. We are seeing a lot of these efforts in states that have traditionally been a hotspot. So places like Texas and Georgia and Arizona. I'm from Texas, so I know we've been watching Texas for a long time. One thing that I think people cannot ignore is that those are 3 states that have very rapidly changing political and ethnic demographics. I think it is very hard to look at the data and see what actually happened in those states and see what people are proposing and see how they're kind of speaking past each other and reach any other conclusion that there are some politicians that would rather make laws that make it easier for some people to participate and some people not than actually competing for votes. And I think that that creates a great deal of distortions in our political system. So what do these restrictions on voting look like? Most of them have been targeted at mail voting. They have been, and they've taken a bunch of different forms. They've been doing things like making it harder to get a mail ballot, making it harder to complete and get that mail ballot counted. We've seen states try to enhance or make more strict and more rigorous their voter ID requirements. We're seeing a number of states making it harder for people to register to vote and making it harder for groups like the League of Women Voters to go out and register people to vote. And we're seeing lots and lots of bills that would demand a more aggressive removal or purging of people from voter rolls. Again, as I mentioned, there's a big difference between passage and introduction, but many of these restrictive bills are moving. We've seen at least 55 bills move, and by that we mean they've either had a significant committee action like a hearing, or they've actually passed through a chamber. And in March, we've already had states pass a number of these bills. And, you know, right now my phone is blowing up because there's a conference committee happening right now in Texas. We're certainly in the middle of big policy discussions where big things are going to be happening or not in Arizona. Discussions happening in New Hampshire. There's a lot of activity, and before we're done, I would not be surprised if we saw more restrictive legislation, a lot more restrictive legislation passed this legislative session than we did even after 2010 and 2011, which again is what I said was the first time we started seeing this pushback on the right to vote. You know, there's a lot of bills that we're watching. These are particular numbers for those that like to be focusing on specific things. But what I would say is important to remember is that Americans of all walks of life are trying to come in. We're seeing a lot of business groups taking the position that it is bad for business. It's bad for the economy, for politicians to be so out of step with what it is that their voters want, and to be deciding that the #1 priority was to keep themselves in power rather than being responsive to what the voters need. We're seeing politicians say that if we don't have free, fair, and accessible elections, that we're worried about the business environment for companies to operate, and that we're very worried about our employees, how our employees are going to be able to take control of themselves and their lives if they are really being serious about this. So where does that mean where we are now? We also have bills that are making it easier for people to vote. Looking at things like mail voting, some states call it absentee voting. It depends a bit upon the practice. We have things like early voting. We have things like expanding access to voter registration. And we're seeing a lot of movement on restoring voting rights to people with criminal convictions in their past. New York just passed a law making it such that everybody in the community is able to vote irrespective of their past criminal conviction. And Washington State passed a similar law, and Connecticut just had a piece of legislation like that pass the Senate. So what are things you can do? There's a lot. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It is something that in order for it to work, we all have to be involved and engaged in. There are tons and tons of ways in which you can participate. I hope everybody on this call volunteered to be a poll worker. I hope everyone on the Zoom made sure that their eligible neighbors were able to vote. And I hope that everyone on the Zoom were looking for ways in which they could help people get to the polls and to be able to participate. I get asked a lot of questions like, what can I do? What I would say is you think about the people in your lives, in your circle, who have like the least fixable schedule, that have the hardest time managing logistics, and offer to help them, right? If you can babysit somebody's kids so that they can stay at the polling place, In case the lines are long, do it. If you're an employer and can give people the time off so that they can go and register to vote, please do it. If you are excited about democracy, you should be telling your state lawmakers, especially your state lawmakers, how important it is for us to have a free, fair, and accessible elections, and to make sure that every eligible American has an equal opportunity to cast a ballot that count, and that we don't have any unnecessary barriers to the ballot box. I think state legislators really need to hear from people. I think people think so much stuff is happening at the congressional level, at the presidential level, that they forget that many of the things that matter most to us happen at the state and local level. There's two pieces of federal legislation that you can certainly support. One of them is the For the People Act, which is an omnibus piece of federal legislation that looks at what has gone wrong in the last election over the last decade, and takes best practices from the state and sets those as minimum federal floors. So states can certainly do better than that minimum federal floor. But they can't dip below that minimum federal floor on areas that the For the People Act has spoken to. And then there's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would be restoring people restoring the strength of the VRAA, which is one of our pride and joys in the country, the Voting Rights Act. It was passed in '65 to make sure that it wouldn't matter what your skin color was when you are able to step into the ballot box, that you are free from racial discrimination in voting, and that you are able to be sure that racial discrimination is not going to be impeding your vote. The Voting Rights Act was weakened in 2013 by a Supreme Court decision called Shelby County versus Holder, because the Supreme Court decided that the way in which Congress had decided which states and which jurisdictions were going to have to be subject to a bunch of different rules would make it, was not modern enough. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does modernize the formula in accordance with what the Supreme Court asked for. There was a hearing today on the Voting Rights Act, but these are two important pieces of legislation that put federal guardrails on this. It's really important to remember that states can still innovate, and there's a bunch of stuff that states can do. What they cannot do is impose barriers that make it harder for people to vote in a way that is inconsistent with what federal law says. And that is pursuant to the Constitution and the Election Clause. So we are able to strike a balance with the way this country's systems of elections have been set up, where federal government has certain authority for federal elections, states have certain authority for state and other elections. Both of these two pieces together will do a lot to combat the anti-voter legislation that we see in the state. And then finally, I think you can support state-based democracy reform organizations and organizers. It's really important that people know the facts on the ground and know what the communities on the ground need in order to be able to best serve their constituencies and their communities, and in order to be able to look at all of the different policy needs that are happening at the same time, and how we strike the right appropriate balance for those things. And that means supporting your local groups and your local state groups. So this is my, I'm going to stop sharing now. This is my email. If folks have questions, I'm happy to answer it. Marilyn or Andy, how did you guys want to handle the questions and answers?
Andy, let's see what we have here. Hold on one second. Let me just go ask you first, in a positive and a negative way, what do you think have been the most important reforms or stride in expanding voting rights or voter access? And what have been the most problematic bills recently introduced concerning voting rights or voting access?
That's a great question. I tend to not speak in terms of most or worse or best, because I think just because something had a big impact in one state doesn't mean if you take that policy and move it to somewhere else, you're going to have the same kind of impact, because every community is different and you need to have a very localized appraisal of what's going on. But what I'll say is something that I think is a good step in the right direction is the work that is happening in the states to restore voting rights to people with criminal convictions in their past. It is one that has enjoyed a great deal of bipartisan support. People of all political backgrounds tend to not believe it is appropriate to write somebody off forever because of something that they did after, certainly after they've paid their debt to society and served their time. You know, for the first time in this nation's history, we have no state that permanently disenfranchises all of its citizens with felony convictions, which is something that we can be proud of, and something that I think has come a little bit too late in this country's history. But we don't have any state that does that anymore. And that's something that we can feel good about. And that's something that I think speaks to the idea of progress. Some of the things that most concern me are the things that are not very data specific. Like, so for example, when people say, oh, we need to be worried about voter fraud, and then they point to an example like the North Carolina atrocity, where a political operative, a political insider, went in and took other people's votes and spoiled their ballots and didn't turn them in, and then say something like that justifies a strict photo ID law. Those two don't speak to each other. Like, if somebody wants to punish partisan operatives who go and steal voters' ballots and spoil them instead of casting them, that's a policy we can discuss. When people say, oh, fraud happened in the North Carolina 9, so we need a photo ID law, you're targeting the wrong people. Like, one circumstance, fraud was perpetrated upon voters. And then in another circumstance, you're seeing politicians put barriers upon voters instead of actually having a solution that fixes the problem that they identified. And so that's where I think it's really hard to have some of these conversations, because they're not happening from positions of good faith. Because, you know, we're not, too often we don't see what went wrong and then a solution that responds to it. We see something that went wrong and then all of a sudden something else that just hurts voters, that aren't actually going to make them more secure, aren't going to make our elections have more integrity, and aren't going to make our elections more safe. And so I think what I would say more broadly is the ones that concern me the most are the ones that are exploitive, the ones that are for show, the ones that are leveraging and capitalizing people's fear about fraud or integrity, and aren't actually fixing any problems. If people are concerned about election integrity, they should be spending a lot of time worrying about foreign cyber criminals trying to hack our elections. They should not worry about, like my former client, Sammy Louise Bates, who didn't have enough money to go and get a birth certificate, but had been voting for all of her life, not being able to vote because she didn't have an ID. They're not the same thing. There are things that reasonable people can agree on. There are things that data shows are a problem. And then we see what some of the politicians are doing, and they don't map up.
You know, I think one of the things that the League has always emphasized to folks is that everyone has to show some kind of voter ID when they go to the polls. I think the question of photo voter ID, people don't understand exactly what you just said. They have to go, folks who have no transportation or can't afford it, have to get a certified birth certificate. They have so many documents that they have to get that they frequently cannot get. So I think that has been one of our great concerns about people assuming that when you go to the polls, you can just go and say, I'm so-and-so. You show something, and I believe every state. Am I correct in that?
You have some sort of identification.
Right.
Like, it looks different in different states. Some of it is documentary proof, some of it is a signature matching, some of it is a match by looking at your social security number or looking up your driver's license number. There's different ways that states do it. But I think this is a really important topic, because I think this is where it's important that people get outside of their own sense of selves. I think one of the reasons why people support photo ID laws, and I want to be very clear that I'm talking about strict photo ID
Right.
laws. I'm
Yes.
talking about laws that set forth certain requirements and only permit certain kinds of ID that that percentages of population don't have.
Right.
The reason why I think that conversation is so hard for folks is because most of us have IDs.
Right.
Right. Most of us have IDs. The studies are that somewhere between 88% and 92% of Americans have the kind of ID that is required by these strict photo ID laws. But we're not a country, we're not a democracy for some of us or even most of us. We should be a democracy for all of us.
Right.
I would submit that there has to be a way for people who are eligible Americans to be able to cast a ballot that counts without having an ID, when we know that between 8 and 12% of eligible Americans don't have them. Now, that may not mean that 8 to 12% of the people you know don't have them, or 8 to 12% of the people that are in your country club or went to your school or even go to your church have them. But 8 to 12% of Americans have them, and the studies are pretty consistent that that's the range that we're looking at. And so I, for one, am not comfortable saying that those folks don't get to cast ballots, and I don't think anybody else should be. We need to have common sense ways that allow people who have IDs to be able to participate, but we also need to have common sense ways to not make being able to afford all of that documentary stuff plus getting to an issuing license office be a contingent upon the right to vote. There's many countries that require IDs, but those are also countries that give you that ID. They don't charge you for it. Government takes on the responsibility of making sure you have it and making sure you get it. And this country has not made that kind of investment because we're not a show me your papers kind of country. So if we're not going to be that country where we're giving everybody the ID, then I think it's really hard to say we need to pair the fundamental right to vote to that.
Andy, I haven't been checking. Let me check the Q&A.
I've been looking a little bit. There's a question about what can a voter in Connecticut realistically do to influence legislation that's either pending or has passed in other states like Texas or Arizona. What would you recommend?
I tend to think of the long game and the big game, and to me that means making the case every day for a robust participatory democracy. Like, if you are a person that even if you live in a state like Connecticut, like I hope that you are talking to people at your library or talking to Girl Scouts or volunteering with your church youth group, and where you are reminding people that one of the big ideals of this country is that it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, black or white, educated or not. When you step into the ballot box, your vote counts just as much as anybody else's, and that we are not going to tolerate politicians who want to cheapen the right to vote so that they can have job security, right? So that they don't have to compete for votes, so that they are immune to what voters are telling them. And I think that working in your state, making that investment, especially, and I don't know where Connecticut is on this, but like many states across the country aren't teaching civics the way that they used to, or at all, because of budget cuts to schools. Like, it's really important that voters and Americans step into the breach and just make sure that we are explaining very clearly that our democracy works best when it includes all of us.
Okay, there is a gentleman who has been quite prolific in his comments.
I'm seeing this guy.
And out of respect for the library and the league and you, I'm going to use one of his questions that if you would like to respond to, you may. It says, you say free, fair, and accessible, but does election integrity matter? Integrity meaning, for example, active prevention of fraud and electioneering, exclusion of ineligible voters, chain of custody preservation. In what ways do your proposals advance your election integrity?
I am so glad you asked this, Mr. David, because I'm about to send you a report that I wrote about 5 years ago on how you can engage in election integrity measures and without disenfranchising people. So if you give me 2 minutes, I'm going to put it for all panelists and in the chat. Give me just 1 second to pull it up for you. It's actually called Election Integrity, a Pro-Voter Agenda. So it's there for folks. I would also say that there is something important to say about a language. I don't think our election has integrity when there are concerted efforts of people in power to shut out certain voices. That's also an election integrity issue. We need to make sure that the outcomes are as the voters intended. I think there are a lot of ways this country can and should be doing better. We should be doing more to harden our election systems against foreign cyber criminals and domestic cyber criminals for that matter. We should be making sure that we spend more on our elections in training our election administrators and supporting our election administrators in making sure that they have the resources they need in order to give voters top flight customer service. Part of election integrity is making sure that our education, that our voters are well educated, that they understand the nuts and bolts of how elections work and how our country runs, and that they can trust their politicians to be giving them fair and accurate facts. I think there's a lot that goes into election integrity, and I reject the idea that we have to choose between election integrity and access. I think we don't. I think we can figure out what the real problems are, assess the risk, and have proportionate and thoughtful responses that are data-driven, experience-driven in response to that risk.
Thank you. Now, Marilyn J. asks, I live in a vote by mail state, Oregon. Can you talk about more states going to that model and the attempts to support or derail this method of voting?
Voters, you know, we need to make sure that we talk about like what it means, like the Oregon model. So for people that aren't aware, Oregon is what we call an all vote by mail state, which basically means that they have a very small number, not a no number, but a very small number of polling places. And the vast majority of their voters get a ballot that is sent to them, and they return it via mail. They can return it in a drop box. They can return it by putting it in the post office. They can return it by dropping it off at the election office, but there's not like polling places the way that we think of. Then vote by mail so the idea of voting by mail means having a ballot that is sent to you and then returning it. And within that, there's different kinds of vote by mail. There's like no excuse absentee voting. There's absentee ballots. There's, you know, those all sorts of stuff that are going to depend upon how states call it. Like Jersey is like in-person early voting, which is really more like what absentee ballots look like. But I think that what has happened as a result of the pandemic is that more and more people like the idea of voting from home, and that more and more people like the convenience of being able to cast a ballot by mail and not having to go into a polling location at a particular point in time. And so what I think the fight is going to be over in the next couple of years, and we're seeing it right now, is like, what are going to be the restrictions on who can use a vote at home or a vote by mail option? And there's not a lot of folks talking about moving to Oregon beyond the ones that already do it. So it's Oregon, it's Washington, it's Colorado. California has something similar to an all vote by mail system. But we're having such a fight in the states about rolling backwards on access to vote by mail or access to absentee ballots, whatever your state calls it, that I think a move like Oregon is probably going to take a lot longer. And for me, I love polling places. Like, I love going to my firehouse. I love thanking the poll workers for their public service. I love standing in line. Like, election day is like my favorite day, right? It's like my favorite day because you have people from all walks of life showing that they care about their country so much that they're willing to like stand in line to be able to be a part of it. So, I am hopeful that we still maintain the polling place options for folks, but it's certainly something that people are talking about.
If I can interject about Connecticut concerning no excuse absentee balloting for a minute. We are one of very few states who do not have no excuse absentee ballot, I think one of 13. And we are one of 5 who currently don't have in-person early voting. And that's because of our Connecticut Constitution. And as of 40 minutes ago, the Senate passed the early voting resolution, which the House passed by 115 to 26, to place a question on the 2022 general election ballot, asking voters if the state constitution should be amended to allow in-person early voting before an election or referendum. If that passes, then the Assembly can institute in-person early voting. The no excuse absentee ballot question concerning the changing the Connecticut Constitution, unfortunately did not pass by a super majority, which is required. So they will have to, the House passes by 102 to 44. And since the bill didn't reach its 75% threshold, it will appear as a referendum on the ballot at the earliest in 2024 if it passes a simple majority in the Senate. So that's where Connecticut is concerning in-person early voting and no excuse absentee balloting. Andy, what else do we see as far as questions are concerned? One question someone wanted to know is, how do you prevent non-citizens from voting?
Well, one, you make it illegal. That is true. It is illegal it is often a deportable offense. People have and are being deported for it. You educate people as to what the eligibility rules and requirements are. And you let people know when they're registering and voting that they have to be a citizen. And if someone is willful and purposely violating that, then they get punished. I mean, I think I am being, my parents are from Mexico. They lived in this country for a really long time before they were naturalized. I am increasingly concerned about what I see as the racialization of the voter fraud myth. We're seeing politicians use really rude and offensive words about some people voting in California or in Texas, and they're, it's always places like California or Texas who should not be voting. When there's very, very little evidence that anybody actually is, the costs are really high. My experience is that, non-citizens are excited to be in this country and they try really hard. The vast majority of them to do things that keep them under the radar, that keep them on a pathway to citizenship, and that they, when they do become citizens, and for those of you that are skeptical about the contributions that like immigrants and non-citizens make to this country, you should go to a naturalization ceremony. You should go and see like how proud to vote folks are. And there's pretty good statistics that say that newly naturalized citizens have better voting rates than many native-born Americans. So I think, I'm going to put in another report that we've written. Give me a second. there were lots of claims right after the 2016 election about all these so-called non-citizens voting, and supposedly had it happened, it happened in rates that would have changed the popular vote, supposedly. The data didn't produce that. That's not what the data says. And it's really hard to have conversations when people are talking about like hunches and speculation and guesses and worries as opposed to actual facts. And some of this stuff can be tested. So, my hope is that even folks who may think that I'm a bit optimistic about the idea and the importance of a robust and participatory democracy, or at least committed to the idea of looking at research and data and making sure that the actual problems that do exist have a close connection, have a tight fit between the kinds of solutions that we're seeing. And when they don't, demand that they do. That I think would be a very strong demonstration of good faith and of finding common ground. Like stuff that everybody agrees was a problem, everybody agrees that we could do better. Make sure instead of just claiming, oh, there's massive voter fraud, so we need to put barriers in front of the ballot box, how about we try and fix that one thing that we saw? And I think that that would go a lot further to getting bipartisan support and getting us on the right path of being a country where everybody agrees that the right to vote is important, and that we are worse off when our neighbors aren't able to vote, even if they have differing viewpoints than we do.
We did have a question asking if you would support the restoration of full constitutional rights to those with felony convictions.
I'm not sure exactly what the question is. What I will say is that I am a person of faith, and I believe that people can be redeemed. And I also am a researcher and a study of elections. And one of the things that the data and the experts seem to be pretty consistent on is that if we want people to successfully re-enter, we need to make them stakeholders. That giving people rights and responsibilities, including the right and responsibility of voting, makes our environments safer, it enhances public safety, and it makes stakeholders that are invested in their community. I mean, when you think about it, it's really logical. Like, the vote is pregnant with so many pro-social values. It says there's a way we resolve our political differences peacefully. You have to vote at a certain time under a certain way. You have certain eligibility rules. You have to accept the outcome, even if it wasn't what you hoped for, right? Those are very pro-social behavior that we want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to model and to live out, even people, especially people that have engaged in antisocial behavior in the past, which is why organizations like the Association for Paroling and Probation Authorities support voting rights to people when they're in the community. That's why the international polling authorities support restoring voting rights to people in the community. That is why community supervisory professional networks support voting rights to people in the community, once they've been released from prison or if they haven't gotten in. Like, if we are going to make sure that people are functioning and contributing, just like we expect people to drop their kids off at school and pay their taxes and get jobs, we should expect them to vote, because that's a form of public service too. And I think that if we as a country embrace that idea, we would start seeing real change in terms of public safety and seeing real change in democracy. Like, I wish we could do a polling function. I bet most of the people on this Zoom at some point were taken to the polls by their parents. I bet most people on this Zoom had parents that were voters. So what happens when you have entire communities where the men or the adults aren't able to vote because of criminal convictions in their past? You raise children that can't vote. And we see that there have been a couple of Brennan Center recent studies that show that having high rates of disenfranchisement in the community because of past convictions actually depress the turnout and participation by neighbors and family members. Because voting is such a powerful pro-social act. I mean, think about when you go to vote, you like rile up your friends to go vote. You take your family, you make sure that, you know, Miss Lois from your church is able to get there. And if you don't have people doing that, you decrease the overall amount of participation in democracy. Nobody wins when we do that. Nobody wins when we do that. We're shutting out voices and experiences and expertise that we need.
Could you just for a moment talk about HR1, which I guess is S1 now?
It's past the House, so it still exists.
One of David seems to feel that it's hijacking local control by putting in federal regulations. But could you just highlight some of the key things that would, you know, help people understand it a little better?
Well, I think the thing that would help people understand it the most is the Constitution. And the Constitution gives the federal government broad authority for federal elections. And it would make sense that it would, right? Like when the Constitution was first formed, there were states that, you know, didn't want to see a strong federal government, right? So it would make sense that the government can protect itself, the federal government can protect itself. So we have a system whereby states deal with issues of things like qualifications and run state elections and the nuts and bolts, the machinery of the elections. And the federal government is able to set rules for federal elections. And then we also have the 14th and the 15th Amendment, which puts on Congress, not on the states, on Congress, the responsibilities of making sure that there's no racial discrimination in our elections. So when you take the responsibilities of the Elections Clause and you take the responsibilities under the 14th and 15th Amendment, that sets forth a framework that allows Congress to have a say in what happens in federal elections. And if Congress is looking at ways in which state politicians are trying to make it harder for people to vote in federal elections, Congress can take a look at other states and set a minimum floor. And again, for folks that have federalism concern, the states can always do better, right? Like, you know, the states can always decide, you know, if Congress is going to say you need X number of early voting days, a state can decide to give more, right? Like, so there is some federal control. It's not a race to the bottom, but it's actually a floor that you can't go below. And so I think that that's really important. And I think that, again, if there was one thing that voters made clear, it doesn't matter what your political background is, you care about your right to vote. You want to exercise it. And so coming up with ways in which everybody gets the same, or everybody gets at least a basic minimum level of customer service, irrespective of where you live, I think is a big step forward. And I think Americans think it's a big step forward. I did so many talks right before the elections, and I can't tell you how many people were like, it's too confusing. Like, there's this rule in this state, there's this rule in that state, and there's this policy in this state, and then this policy in that state. And some people call it vote by mail, and some people call it absentee voting. You know, I think states should innovate, and I think states should look at what their communities are offering and what their community needs and be responsive to that. But I think a minimum federal floor is going to be well received by voters.
Andy, is there anything else there? Oh, here's a good question. What are your thoughts on eliminating the Electoral College?
I don't tend to speak on that issue right now. I feel like that's a big structural debate that lots of people are having. What I'm worried about right now is who can vote in the elections that are happening tomorrow and the day after that. I mean, certainly the Brennan Center as an institution would like electoral college reform, and that's one of our positions. You know, it's not something that I work on. And again, I'm excited for people to be passionate about improving our country so that it hears from all of our rich and diverse voices. So if that's your jam, excited for you to go to it. I hope the Brennan Center's website for resources on that, but that's not usually something I spend a lot of time talking about.
Okay. Is there anything else that we see that?
I don't see anything, Marilyn, that has not already been covered topic-wise.
Right,
I think in
right.
Myrna's presentation, and then in the questions we've already covered. I guess at this point, we will just wrap it up and thank Myrna so much for being with us this evening and really illuminating a lot of issues that sometimes are given a really surface coverage. And it's been such a pleasure to have you with us to go a little bit deeper. I do want to mention coming up in September and early October, the library, the League of Women Voters, the Historical Society, Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center, and the DAR will combine forces again to do a series about the First Amendment. And we'll be looking at a lot of aspects of the First Amendment. We'll have panel discussions and individual presentations. So keep watching the library website for more about our First Amendment series this fall. And Marilyn, I'll pass it over to you to wrap up.
And I just want to thank you all for coming today. Ms. Pérez, you have any final words of wisdom for us, or?
I think, I was looking at the chat and there were clearly a couple of folks that may have struck a nerve. And what I would say is, I very much care about your right to vote too. Like, you can insult me, call me an elitist, whatever other awful things that I'm deliberately you can do any of that stuff, but I'm spending my life and my life's work making sure that you have a free and fair, accessible vote, because I actually think that our country works best when I hear from all of us. And when my candidate or the candidate I'm supporting doesn't win, I chalk it up to me having to work harder next time. I believe that we need a rule of law and that we need an election and a democracy that reflects all of us. And I'm hoping that if you believe the same, that you talk to your compatriots that may or may not have that view. Because as a woman of color, as the daughter of immigrants, I can tell you there are plenty of people in this country that unfortunately I have to work against or with or alongside that think that the world would be better if there were people like me not voting. And I don't believe that. I believe that our country is better because people like you are voting, even if I disagree with them. So I believe that there's room in this country for all of us. I think we need to have some shared values. And that means making sure that all of us, irrespective of how poor you are, how uneducated you are, what the color of your skin is, what your religion is, if you are an American, you are over 18, we want you voting.
And I think that's a perfect way to end this webinar. And thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
I want to wish everyone a happy Memorial Day, and remember to salute the flag and those who have served our country. That's it for me.
That's it. Everyone have a lovely evening.
Thank you.